right, so first off, before we start, I want to give you a little bit information about me. As Kelly has already said, my name's Brian Davis. I'm the MS4 coordinator for Lower Swatara Township in Dauphin County. I've held this position since last July. Before that, I spent about a decade in the private industry doing a bunch of engineering related activities, stormwater BMP design, DEP permitting, erosion sediment control, and outfall inspections. Um, I think this experience has kind of given me a broad understanding a lot of different parts of MS4. So I was kind of excited to actually volunteer for this because it's given me a chance to sort of share what I've learned and hopefully also learn more. So as Kelly said, today I'm going to be talking about illicit discharge detection and elimination, and I'll start with like a brief overview of everything. That way, if you're not as familiar with the MS4 program, we can all be on pretty much the same page. So the most important thing to start off with is what's a discharge. Um, if you go by DEP's definition, it's any measurable flow of water from a storm system uh, during dry weather conditions. Um, what this basically means is if water is flowing out of a stormwater outfall when there's no precipitation, then your outfall has a discharge. And you might be thinking, how can there be a discharge when there's no rain? Well, it's actually pretty common. It can be caused by a bunch of different things like slow release BMPs or, looking outside, melting snow might cause it. So it's a lot more common than you might think. Regular stormwater discharge is generally not harmful for the environment. Generally, I say. On the other hand, illicit discharges are usually bad for the environment. And they're normally caused by humans. The easiest example I can give is some sort of evil corporation that's illegally dumping their chemicals into a stream. But there are a lot of other less obvious possibilities, like a truck drives down the road and it's got just a leaky oil situation. That oil gets on the road, washes into a stormwater, uh, into a storm drain, and then into the river. That's also an illicit discharge. And see, that's the important part to remember here. It doesn't matter if it's intentional or it's accidental. We're not really looking to try and cast blame so much as just recognize that there's an issue and try to fix it. Not all human activity is illicit discharge. There are certain activities that are permissible. Firefighting activities, for example, are a great example of non-illicit discharges. Normally, we don't care if you're trying to save people's lives, and if a little bit of extra chemical or whatever gets into the water, it's not ideal, but better we don't let people die. Also, washing your car, while it may wash some soap in downstream, it's not the end of the world. We're looking more for reoccurring issues that cause major disruptions to an ecosystem. Uh, you also notice I mentioned discharges from already regulated NPDES facilities. The main reason I mention this is because it's in the DEP guidelines. But you should know that if certain things are coming from those facilities that don't belong in the water, that's still technically an illicit discharge. They're just not obeying the rules that are set by the NPDES permit that they have. So that's just something to sort of be aware of. I thought it'd be a good idea to show a couple examples as well of illicit discharges or non-discharges. If you look at these two pictures, the one on the left, at first glance, doesn't look too bad. But if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture, you'll notice that there's some rainbowy sheen on the water. That's caused by an oil spill that happened from a vehicular accident. Not all the oil was properly cleaned up. It got into an inlet and then it discharged into a nearby receiving water. That's a great example of an illicit discharge, not intentional, but still needs to be taken care of. If you look at the picture on the right, it's actually an interesting photo. You'll notice that there's this like red goopy stuff. That's the water. And this is actually taken from Lower Swatara a couple years ago from our previous MS4 coordinator. She went out, noticed this. I think she had received a complaint about it. She took some pictures, did some investigation. Eventually, it led to the decision from all the people investigating that this goopy stuff is actually caused by decomposing leaves. Was the decision made by our engineers and our coordinator. So you might say, well, if it's decomposing nature, that's totally fine. It's not an illicit discharge. The answer to that is yes and no, because you have to remember what's causing those leaves to be there. If it's an oak tree that just happened to drop all of its leaves in one spot and they all decomposed, that's fine. But if a tree dropped leaves on a resident's property and that resident gathered all those leaves and just blew them into the gutter, that's not fine, because that's human interaction causing a disturbance downstream, and that becomes an illicit discharge. So it's not just what causes it, but also why was it caused that we have to sometimes remember. And our township actually does do a good job of taking care of that specific issue with leaves. We have a leaf collection system in place during the fall where residents can pile their leaves on the curb, and then we'll have members of our public works crew come out, collect those leaves, and take them to a recycling center just to prevent this kind of issue. So it's a good way to kind of recognize that maybe there's some issues that you can address in non-traditional ways. And finally, you have to also remember that illicit discharges don't have to be liquid. I think when I first started, I had this idea that, okay, it's oil, it's chemicals, stuff like that. Illicit discharges can be trash. If you leave trash in the gutter, if you toss it into a stream, that technically is a discharge. So what it creates is the discharge. And that also needs to be addressed. All right, so DEP has provided 6 major best management practices, or BMPs, for townships or government agencies to follow. The first one is a written maintenance program. The second one is outfall mapping. The third is storm sewer system mapping, and those two are very closely related, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. The fourth is dry weather inspections. It's kind of the big part of this MCM. Fifth is stormwater ordinance, and then the sixth is public education. So why don't we start with written program? As I mentioned, the first thing required by DEP is that you have a written program in place for dealing with illicit discharges. And when I say written, it should be physical in nature. Don't just have like a general idea in your head. Don't have some notes scribbled down that only you know about. Whatever you create should be, it can be a simple cheat sheet or, a very lengthy SOP, but it needs to be physical. And I say this because it helps to ensure standard practice throughout your township. While you may know exactly what needs to be done, you may not always be there. Maybe you go on vacation and someone needs to, and there's an issue while you're gone, or maybe you've chosen to go to a new place to work. The next person who shows up to do your job should know exactly what system is in place. That way it prevents issues from falling through the cracks. So there's several major procedures that you should include in your written program. The first is identifying high-risk areas and how to screen them. A lot of this kind of circles back towards knowing some danger spots, as well as just sort of tracking where your outfalls are. And we'll cover that a bit more in BMPs 2 and 3. And the second part is you should know how to locate the source of an illicit discharge. Uh, Once you find illicit discharges, you need to track them back to where they're coming from. That way you can address the root problem of the situation, which leads to the next point, treating illicit discharges. There's a ton of different types of discharges, and they all have different ways to deal with them. So you're never going to be able to have all of them in all the solutions in your written program. But it's a good idea to keep at least a general list of common issues you might come across and how to address them. Do you need to just notify a a resident of the public, tell them, hey, you're accidentally polluting a stream? Do you need to assess a fine? Do you need to clean up a spill because this is a recurring issue? These are the kinds of things you should have in your written program. The next thing to mention is tracking potential threats. This does tie very closely to your high-risk areas, but it can also be separate. A good example of this is our township tracks above-ground storage containers. We have a full database list of it. And the reason we do this is, let's say we find an oil spill in the water. Well, if I look at our list of above-ground storage units and I find that there's an oil tank just upstream of this spill, I have a pretty good idea where this oil is coming from. I mean, not guaranteed, but I have a pretty good idea. And the final thing to mention, and this is actually, I feel, one of the most crucial, is handling complaints from the public. As an MS4 coordinator, I have a lot of stuff that I look at day in, day out, and I have to work on. And even if you're not an MS4 coordinator, if you're an engineer or anything of that sort, there's a lot on your plate all the time. So working with the public is a great option because they can kind of be your eyes and ears. But they can only do that if there's a system in place. So it's a good idea for townships and municipalities and government agencies and such to have sort of a lot of different ways for people to contact you, not just by phone, but also online complaint forms, physical complaint forms that they can mail in. Any way you can provide people a chance to talk to you coherently is a good idea because it helps to develop a relationship with the public. Lower Swatara does have an online complaint form, and we also take calls, obviously. And once we address any issue that's presented to us, we always follow back up with the complainant. That way, they know that the problem's been addressed, and they know that we're paying attention to them. Transparency and communication go a long way to encouraging the public to work with us, not against us, as it were. All right, so BMPs 2 and 3 are all about stormwater system mapping. You'll notice I do have both of these systems, both of these BMPs together. That's because they're just so integral. Even DEP acknowledges this, and they say you should just map everything on the same one if possible. Now, the reasoning behind why you should be mapping this should be self-evident, but just to be clear, you can keep a spreadsheet of all the outfalls within your township or your municipality or whatever, and that can be great, and it can have all the latitudes and longitudes and state plane coordinates and whatever, but nothing beats just having a map that you can point to and say, this is where the outfall is, now I know how to get to it. And so that to me, a map is essential. Knowing the locations of your outfalls helps to coordinate inspections and monitoring. And I say this because it helps to break out a lot of your outfalls into groups. Maybe you can't do an inspection of all your outfalls in the township in a given year. That's fine, you don't have to, but it helps to kind of look at the overall map of your township and say, well, we have a lot of outfalls on the west side and a lot of outfalls on the east side. Why don't we make these two separate groups and then coordinate our inspections so that we alternate between those, the west and the east, every other year? As far as BMP3, which is all about storm sewer mapping, it's really good to have this on the same map because it helps you to track down any causes of an illicit discharge. And when I say that, I mean, if you know the point where an illicit discharge has occurred, it's easy to sort of look back up through the pipes, through your swales or whatever, and see, well, the water's coming from here. So the source of your illicit discharge is probably coming from here too. And so it helps to actually track all this stuff down. When you map your storm sewer, you should also, as a side note, make sure that you're mapping not just the pipes and the inlets, but also your basins and your swales and any other stormwater BMPs that you might have. And for the same reason that, it helps to track everything down, but also because for at least in Lower Swatara, we use this same map for other MCMs. When I do inspections of BMPs, I use the same mapping system, and the mapping and the inspection is done identically in both cases using the same forms and everything. So it actually helps streamline my whole workflow. Now, as I did mention, maps are very important. You don't have to use anything fancy. At worst case scenario, you can print out something from Google Maps and put little push pins in it. But if you use a mapping software like ArcGIS, for example, it can add a huge amount of utility because you can embed extra information right into your map. And this data can be accessible wherever you go. We have iPads in the township that I will take out with me to do inspections in the field. I can pull up these maps and click on points, and it will bring up, the outfall you're at should be a 48-inch pipe. And it will say, this was the last time it was inspected. There was an illicit discharge at the spot last time you were here, that kind of thing. And that can be really useful to give you a more holistic view of what you're working on. Before I actually jump into dry weather inspections, I'm going to hopefully do this right. Please bear with me. Okay, so you should be seeing a picture of an online GIS mapping. This is the mapping for our township in Lower Swatara. We developed this with our engineer HRG to create a usable map for tracking all of our outfalls and pipes and inlets and such. The yellow dots are outfalls, the green lines are pipes, and then these little purple squares there are the inlets. If I zoom in here and click on this particular outfall, you can actually bring up the full attribute table of what's related to this outfall. Like you can see what elevation it's at. Looks like it's state plane coordinates, who owns that outfall, where it discharges to, that kind of thing. Now, I am working to revamp this system a bit. I've made some updates, but that's still in the works. So this is the most current version that we have. You'll also notice that on this little pop-up, there's this little link called Inspect Outfall. I want you to remember that because we're going to get back to that in just a minute. But in the meantime, back to dry weather inspections. So dry weather inspections are where you go out to your outfall and you make sure that there are no illicit discharges occurring. You should be doing these inspections routinely, at least twice in a 5-year period. Ideally, if you can do it a little bit more often, that's great too. But it has to be at least twice in a 5-year period. any suitably knowledgeable individual can do this inspection. It doesn't have to be a certified engineer. You don't have to have official training of some kind, but it helps to know a lot of this information. And it helps maybe to let an engineer show you how to do a lot of this. I do the inspections for our township, but I also have been trained by an engineer for several years now how to do that kind of thing. So, but bear in mind that this might be something you, as a township, you might want to work towards, having someone in the township themselves handle this inspection process. And it can actually save you a considerable amount of money. And you don't have to give up having an engineer with you all the time. If you go out to a site, 90% of the time, you'll be able to look at an outfall and know that it's okay. But if there's, a bit of question, there's no reason why you couldn't call your township engineer, have them come out and assist you, and it will still cut down your overall costs. But then it gives you a sort of safety net if you're not 100% comfortable. If a discharge is present while you're inspecting that outfall, the first thing you should do is you should test that water. For certain parameters. We here at the township test for things such as pH, temperatures, conductivity, dissolved oxygen, and suspended solids. If any of those parameters are extremely out of the normal range for what you would expect, or if there's some other indicators in the water, like a really weird smell or color, it's a good idea to take a sample and then send it off to a lab for testing. You don't need to do this for every discharge, though. If the water comes clear and everything looks normal, it's water. You're fine. So a lot of people have this idea that they need to send everything off to a lab. You don't need to. Just be cautious, take some tests, make a good judgment call. Also, and I'm kind of anal about this myself, but the inspections should be recorded on a DEP form. DEP provides a very good form for filling out your inspections. You should try to match this format whenever possible, and you'll notice I have in parentheses or an equivalent of this form. And I put this parentheses in because at the township, we use a digital form for all of our inspections. And I'll show that form to you, but it's very close to what DEP uses. And the reason you should try to match DEP is because this is what they expect it to look like. This is what they've developed using their knowledge of illicit discharges, and it helps to create more of a consistency with everything. And finally, any records that you have, at least of illicit discharges, should be submitted with your annual MS4 report. DEP has recently said that they don't want to get every single inspection. This is understandable. These annual reports have gotten quite extensively large over the last few years. So if we can pare that down in a way, I think DP would appreciate that. We should certainly keep all records on hand if we need them. But in order to save everybody's sanity, it's best to only submit the records that are illicit. All right, so the next part here is I'm going to switch back to online. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there's this inspect outfall link. When I'm out in the field, I can pull up this map on my iPad and tap this link, and it brings up a survey. This is a web version of that survey. It uses a program called Survey 123, and this survey is pretty well integrated into ArcGIS. They are separate, but they work together. So it's actually like almost the same. I know that's a terrible explanation. Sorry. So there's this tab up top in our form that has general information. There's like permittee name, NPDES, permit number. You'll notice these are locked in. They're not something that you can fill out yourself. The reason for this is because this form autofills as much as it possibly can, as often as it can, to reduce the time that an inspector has to spend pressing little buttons and typing in the field. So I'm just going to type some stuff real quick here. I'll fill out these check boxes saying what type of land use is above this outfall. And you go through this whole list, and you can say who the inspector is, whether it's a closed pipe. I'll just quickly go through some of this stuff. At the end here, we also have a place where you can take photos of the outfall, and it's a really good idea to do that. I think I can I? Maybe not. I thought maybe you could take a photo here in the survey app as well, but it doesn't look like I can, which is fine. You can also, in addition to taking photos, you can upload images straight from your device, either from your computer or from the app itself. So if I'm working and I realize I've forgotten to attach a photo, I can take it with the iPad and then separately upload it. That's my signature for now, and I submit. So once you fill out your form to your liking, you can submit this in the field, and it will go to an online database. I have the database up on another tab here, and if you are not seeing it, please somebody shout at me. Takes a moment to load, but you'll notice there are two entries. The first one was that's highlighted was a practice that I had done the other day. This one here, it's the actual demo that I just filled out while we were talking. It has a full list of all the stuff that I filled out, the outfall name, whether the inspection was dry weather, that kind of stuff. And you'll notice there's a lot of different categories here. It's because I'm matching the amount of information that's in DEP's, this is that form I was talking about, the outfall screening report. And you'll see it where it requires you to mention your permittee name, date of inspection. All of these have a corresponding field in our report. And when I'm ready to create a copy of DEP's inspection, all I have to do is click up here and click reports. And I'll just do a preview because it costs the township credits to actually generate a full report, but can take a few moments. But what it eventually does is it takes all of the fields that I filled out while actually at the site inspecting everything, and it auto-populates the report from DEP. So here is the township's version of that report, and you'll notice it's virtually identical. I did make one or two minor changes to it, but for the most part, it's exactly the same. Here's the original DEP version. Here's our township version. The great thing about this, as I said, is it's all standardized, which means that when DEP looks at this, it doesn't look alien to them. They don't have to change the way they understand or the way they're looking at this report. Now, if anyone wants to see or get the templates for how I did all of this, I'm happy to pass that information along. I love sharing everything that I've developed. The report itself requires a template, as does the survey 123 itself. So I'm happy to share that. Feel free to send me an email. I work for Lower Swatara. My email's on our website. I think that's all I really needed to show you about Survey 123 and our mapping system. And I, again, just want to point out, this is something very simple that someone with just a little bit of knowledge can do. It takes a lot of setup, But once it's done, you can give an iPad to just about anyone, and they can go out, press the boxes, type in the information, and just call you if you have questions. And that can really cut down on the overall cost of doing an inspection. All right, so I've rambled enough about this topic. And we'll go back to BMP 5, Stormwater Ordinance. This is a pretty short section, and it's very straightforward. At this point, virtually every municipality and government agency has a section of ordinance for stormwater protection. It's pretty much ubiquitous. The ordinance must include a statement prohibiting non-stormwater discharges. This is what gives us the authority to tell people that they can't pollute in the water. It gives us the ability to police illicit discharges and also fine individuals who try to ignore those rules. It's also required by DEP, so we don't really have much say in the matter, but it is a smart decision either way. If you're an entity that doesn't have the authority to enact ordinance, you still must enact an SOP. This is just a standard operating procedures, and it will do the same thing as an ordinance. You must say in your SOP that non-stormwater discharges are prohibited. You should know that DEP has the authority to review and request changes to our ordinance and SOPs if they feel that they are not consistent with the overall state. So it's very important that you keep an eye out for changes to DEP's overall guidelines. That way you can stay up to date yourself and you don't have to worry about an awkward confrontation with DEP. The final category, public education, is kind of a fun one to me anyway. As I mentioned earlier, the public is your friend and your partner. They're your eyes and ears. There's really no way that a single individual or even a full department of staff can effectively maintain a stormwater system. By keeping the public informed, you can help prevent issues from ever even occurring. And when an issue does occur, you can find out about them faster so you can fix them faster. This also goes for your fellow coworkers. I rely very heavily on our public works department to let me know when there's an issue in our stormwater system. This is because they're the ones who are often out in the field doing maintenance activities. So they're often the first people to notice when there's something going wrong. So I rely on them to let me know so that I can coordinate properly how to address those issues. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can educate the public about stormwater. You can post flyers in neighborhoods. You can send out quarterly newsletters, hold seminars, post things on your website. Whatever you do, you should include a couple very important pieces of information. The first is, what should they be looking for? If you don't understand the inherent danger of an oily sheen on water, maybe you'll just think it looks pretty or there's a rainbow. The last thing you'll do is call the township and say, hey, it looks like there's oil in the water. So it's important to educate people to know what to look for. And the second thing is you need to teach people how to best contact you. This is why we also have as many different ways to contact us as possible, because some people prefer using the internet, some people prefer calling, some prefer coming in person. We need to make sure that there's as many ways as possible and that everyone understands the best ways to contact us. Finally, and possibly the most important, we need to teach people how to reduce the risk of illicit discharge altogether. It's fine to fix an issue, but preventing the issue from ever happening is far more ideal. If you want to know more about public involvement in education, you should really check out the MCM 1 and MCM 2 seminar being done by Madison Smith. Unfortunately, it is going on right now during our presentation, but as was previously mentioned by, I think, Kelly, these are all being recorded. So feel free to check these out. I do know that public involvement is, at least for me, very key. Make sure you also train your fellow employees. As I mentioned, your coworkers are a key part to all of this. You should try to do annual trainings of what to look out for. Everything that we're educating the public on, we should also be educating our coworkers with, and keeping it on an annual basis helps us to stay up to date on the newest of information. And finally, don't forget to educate yourself. There's no way you can provide information to others if you're not also learning the best ways to tackle new problems. That's why forums like this that we're doing today are so important, because they help us to learn and to expand our collection of knowledge. All right, and that's pretty much everything I was going to talk about today. Thank you so much for listening and bearing with me. If there are any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and I will be happy to answer them.
Great job, Brian.
Also close
Great. Thank you so much. This is Kelly again, your moderator. I went ahead and kicked us off in the questions in the chat, but feel free. We have about 10 minutes before the session ends. So if you have a question for Brian or generally want to give him a comment on the awesome information he's just provided, feel free to throw that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and ask Brian my question. So you showed us the map that you use, the system, which it seems like a very powerful tool. So when you get public reporting or complaints, do you add that information to the map? And do you keep a record then on the mapping system of where problems have historically been found so that you can kind of prioritize those areas as you do inspections?
Yeah, that is actually a great question. Currently, we do not map a list of complaints and issues. It is something that I intend to do. However, I'm so busy trying to reorganize the mapping that we already have. I haven't gotten to that step yet, but eventually that is my goal. I would like a map that could show me everything that I want to know in one clean image. And one thing I didn't actually show on the GIS mapping is you can keep separate layers and turn them on and off as you need them. So maybe you don't need to know exactly where the pipes are at any given point. So you can turn that layer off, and it helps to clear up the image a lot. But right now we aren't doing the mapping. I do intend to. I think it's a great idea to do that. We do sort of keep a record of where all these are. I have an Excel spreadsheet filled out with all of that, and I do try to keep that in the back of my mind. And that also goes towards keeping a written program in place. This program, it's a good idea to keep problem areas on record as well, because again, if you're not available, someone else can kind of check in, see, has there ever been an issue here before? And then how was it fixed the last time? So yeah, great question.
Well, and just as a follow-up, in terms of your dry weather screening, your outfall inspections, is there a particular way you prioritize how you're going to spend your time and resources? Do you just systematically go, east to west, or do you base it on land use to prioritize those inspections?
Generally, I think the best way to do it is to prioritize it in groups. You look for larger groups. You should try to be in our township. We have about, I think it's 87 outfalls. So if you want to do at least 2 inspections of those outfalls every 5 years, there's a certain amount that you need to do every year, like 30 to 40 or so. If so, you kind of want to group them into those manageable amounts that you can handle. As opposed to land use, I don't know if there's necessarily a huge priority, because everything needs to be inspected. Certainly, if an outfall has a history of being problematic or it's had history of illicit discharges in the past, we have in the past inspected them more frequently. That is something that we'll continue to do as we go along. But as far as like prioritizing based on land use, that's not something we've ever thought of doing. I'd have to actually think about whether the benefits of it. That's an interesting idea, though.
Okay, and because I don't see any other comments in the chat, and because I love IDDE, I have another question for you. And folks, feel free to jump in. We still have 7 minutes. But Brian, can you explain how you train your township staff? You mentioned that it's really important to have them as a partner. So could you talk a little bit about the way you train township staff?
Yeah. So a lot of this actually, generally, I mean, when I go down to talk to our public works department, I often will just sort of give them heads up of things that I've learned. We also maintain 2 bulletin boards in the township building itself with important bits of information, and I try to update that. I'm going to be getting a little bit better about that in the coming year, but I update that with just relevant information that people might use. We also in previous years have used HRG, our engineer, and I'm looking at you, Sean. You're in the chat here. We've had Sean Fabian from HRG come out, and he's actually done an official training with our public works department.
Great. I'm looking to see, we have a comment in the chat for folks talking about how outfall inspections are done for this particular municipality and optimal times of the year to hit. I'm looking to see if there's any other questions for you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is a great comment from Sean. Yeah. Fall is, and I agree, the best time to do outfall inspections, if at all possible. Once the leaves are gone, it's really easy to see what's going on. I have noticed I get less poison ivy when I do the inspections in the fall as well, which I'm pretty susceptible to poison ivy, so that's something I enjoy. It also tends to be a little bit drier than the spring months. So that's also a good plus. It gives you more opportunity to go out. Since dry weather inspections, you have to do them no less than 2 days after the most recent snow or rainfall.
All right, great. Well, I think that's a really helpful tip. So I don't know, Brian, if you want to throw your email in the chat for folks, if they have follow-ups and want to get information from you on your inspection and mapping tool, which seems like it will make life in the field very easy for folks who have that available to them, or if they have any follow-up questions. If you want to put that in the chat, that would be helpful and people can write that down. I don't know, we've got about 4 minutes. Anybody else have a question or a comment for Brian? I thought this was really interesting. Oh, Brian, I do have one other one for you. So do you have any good photos of citizen reporting, kind of catching people in the act, accidentally or intentionally dumping to your MS4?
I do know we have photos. I don't actually have any easily available. In fact, we've now that you mentioned this, I did actually have an argument a couple weeks ago with a resident, well, actually a property owner who he owns a property and he was calling to complain about our stormwater fee that we've recently introduced, and he was talking about how he carefully treats the water and all that, and we happen to actually have photos of them just taking the water and pumping it out of a polluted area and just dumping it into the stream. So that kind of shut him up, as it were.
Oh, wow. Well, I just
Yeah.
want to make a plug that I feel that those are like Yeti photos, right? They're really difficult to capture people in the act of doing things. So when you're doing trainings and you want to show pictures of people actually dumping, Those are really hard to come by. So
They
I
are.
challenge all of you to hold on to those pictures if you get them and share them. I'm working on a training right now for a municipality in Virginia, and they're impossible to find. So, one, if anybody has any, I would love them. And two, share them with each other because they're great for training and public education. That's my plug.
Yeah, that's a good idea.